Welcome back. It's the Big Blue Banter, New York Giants football podcast. I'm Dan Shire, not joined as always my co-host Nick Filato. He's working today, couldn't be here, but we are lucky to have a special guest on today, and it's Sam Monson from the PFF NFL podcast. Sam, how are you doing today? I hope you had a little bit of a break since the draft to kind of recollect and get some time to yourself.
Yeah, I'm doing good. Yeah, it's the first part of the actual offseason in the NFL. The regular season finishes, we're straight into the playoffs. The playoffs finish, you're straight into draft season with the Senior Bowl and the Super Bowl and all those kinds of things. Then your free agency, and then you're the draft for real. And then as soon as the draft finishes, you get the 1 week of like heavy draft recap, and then the next week, that's the first week of the offseason in the NFL, where you get a little bit of time, to decompress and really back down for a bit.
And I know for you, there's not really that much time because you're grinding so much college tape as well. I mean, I listened to a bunch of podcasts from you guys during the pre-draft process. The wide receiver one was like the most extensive look at wide receivers that I think anyone did during this pre-draft process. So it was really an enjoyable listen. And it just goes to show how much tape you guys have watched and what you guys have studied. So I want to start before the draft, though, with the Giants. And I want to start with just the start of the offseason for the Giants and the decision to move on from Wink Martindale, their former defensive coordinator, bring in Shane Bowen. I don't want to say it's running the polar opposite system, but there's a stark contrast when I watch these two coordinators on tape and what they're trying to do. What do you make of the Shane Bowen addition for the Giants? Do you have any insight, maybe what fans can expect based on what he ran in Tennessee?
Yeah, definitely. You're right. A very different type of defensive scheme. Having said that, pretty much everybody's defense is a very different defensive scheme from
True.
Wink Martindale's. I mean, he is one of the few coordinators really out on an island in terms of running his own system that not many other people are running, and certainly nowhere near the sort of variant of that defense that he is running. Even coaches that have coached with him in the past, or guys that are maybe offshoots from the similar coaching tree. So any shift from Wink Martindale was going to go in a radically different direction. And yeah, this is definitely one of the more sort of complete about faces that they could have made, though. Ultimately, I think it's probably the right decision in terms of moving in that direction. Makes sense. Like, Wink Martindale runs a good defense, but it is a very, very unusual defense. It's not one that a lot of other teams are running, and so it's more difficult, I think, to find players for that. And you
Mhm.
have to you have to build an entire scheme and an entire group of personnel to fit that defense. Whereas if you're living in this world of coaching turnover year to year, you maybe want a little bit more versatility in your scheme than that, and be able to take players from different systems all over the defense and plug into the next system. And it's closer to what they've been running before in the past. So there's not as big of an adjustment to be made. So, I think obviously we're going to see a lot more zone coverage in this defense than we saw in Wink Martindale, because he's one of the most man coverage heavy uh, coordinators in football. You're going to see a lot less blitzing as well, for same
Mhm.
reason. When nobody blitzes as much as Wink Martindale does. So I think these things are going to go back towards the middle of the pack in terms of what they do relative to the rest of the NFL.
I really love that point you made about how, given how much turnover there is in the NFL, and the Giants fans are not, they know all about this. We've had a lot of turnover, both GM and coach, in the last 5-10 years. It's better to have that less of a unique system where maybe some of the players and talent don't fit and don't carry over. I also always felt like with Wink Martindale, like, it's fun. It sucks to lose him because it was fun to break down his film because he's just a fun coordinator to watch. But I always felt like against the fast processing quarterbacks, they really gave him a trouble. And to me, his ceiling is if he can somehow get 3 elite corners on the roster like he had at one point in Baltimore. In the NFL, that is so difficult to do, even if you're throwing second, first, third round picks at it. So it's something interesting that I thought. Speaking of the Giants, though, and what they've done this offseason, they got more aggressive than I think people expected them to do in free agency. And in that, I'm including the trade and re-sign for Brian Burns, where they gave him a massive contract and traded the 39th pick. But in addition to that, they brought in 3 veteran offensive linemen, highlighted by John Runyon and Jermaine Illuminor, who potentially could both be starting. Runyon, I think, is a lock starter. Devin Singletary, Drew Lock, and they lost Saquon, Xavier, and Tyrod were kind of the big losses there. But they spent a lot of money and brought in a lot of players, even if it wasn't like the premier offensive lineman. What were your thoughts on what they did in free agency?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it was a concerted effort to overhaul that offensive line that was one of the worst in the NFL last season, and something that absolutely needed to be addressed. And they did it without necessarily breaking the bank at any of those spots, which isn't to say that they didn't maybe overpay at a position or two. I mean, John Runyon That's strong money for a guy that hasn't necessarily played at a particularly high level before. But I think just throwing bodies at that group was as important as anything else. Like they really needed to just bring in competition at every single spot outside of Andrew Thomas at left tackle. The other four spots at least needed some other option there. Illuminor, I think you're right, should start at right tackle unless Evan Neal demonstrates, this massive jump forward in the offseason, which is possible, but I wouldn't exactly be expecting it. Illuminor can start at right tackle, be, I think, a pretty good player there. The other spots are kind of up for grabs, and whoever plays the best in preseason and training camp, I think, can lock those down. But if they can just creep back toward average, that phrase we use all the time on the PFF NFL podcast, the line doesn't need to be good next year. It just needs to not be a catastrophe again, which is what it was, last season. So if that line can creep back toward average with all those additions, that's a big thing, because now you've got a platform to work from, and Daniel Jones, I think as a quarterback, is a bad quarterback if you have a problematic offensive line. Like I think he makes a bad line look worse. But if you can get that group to being a solid unit, now Daniel Jones might have the best receiving core he's had before. And obviously this depends on whether Darren Waller hangs them up or if he wants to play this year. But if Darren Waller's there, now you have Malik Neighbors, you still have Slayton, like you've still got Wan'Dale Robinson. That's actually quite a good receiving core, and the best I think that Daniel Jones had to work with. If the offensive line is halfway decent, this is a group that could, basically rewind the clock, a full year, go back to last year when they gave him the contract and they thought he was going to take a step forward and really show that he could be the guy in this offense. We might be seeing that just a year later and with a lot of water under the bridge from that point.
I want to unpack a couple things you said, one more like 30,000 foot view and one more specific. First one, specific with the offensive line. There was a point last year where you tweeted, and I think it was in October, that the Giants were on pace for to allow 326 pressures on the offensive line, and the most from the season before was 212. I don't know where that ultimately ended up, and I know they improved slightly down the stretch, but it just gives an idea of like where they were at last year. So in your experience, evaluating the NFL year over year, having all the data to work with that you have at PFF, because you just mentioned like all they really need to do, and I agree with it, is get to a league average. But in your experience, going from where they were at last year, is it like realistic for Giants fans to expect that they can take that jump in just 1 year from where they're at to league average?
Yeah, I think because you're only asking them to get to average, that's extremely achievable. And there's this sort of excuse me, there's a risk in, just turning over a lot of personnel on the offensive line. Offensive line is a position where continuity is actually valuable on its own. Like there's worth to keeping the same five guys in the same spot, but not when it's terrible. Like if you have a half good offensive line, there's value in keeping those five guys together, even if you think you can upgrade it at a spot or two. When you have 4 out of 5 guys that are major problems, you might as well just try and replace them all, because the chances are you're not getting worse. And Tennessee tried that as well. A couple of teams have taken this swing in recent years. So I think because of where the Giants were, if they replace 4 out of 5 starters or 3 out of 5, the chances are they've taken a significant upgrade at each one of those spots, because those guys were playing at that kind of level. We know Andrew Thomas is a top tier caliber left tackle, and well capable of being part of a great offensive line, not just part of an average one. So I think it's quite achievable to get this group back to being average across the board. And even if you have one problematic spot that remains, if you've got one superstar, 3 guys that are playing fine, and then one problematic spot, even that should be an average offensive line. You can hide one guy. The problem is when you have 3 or 4 that you need to hide, it's not doable. So I think it is quite achievable to bounce back from terrible to fine, to league average quite quickly. Taking that next step is the more difficult one. Getting from average to good, I think, is a much more difficult thing to achieve.
That's a great point. And I think hopefully the Giants fans, if they can get to average, the Giants fans will be happy with that, given what they've watched over the last 5-10 years. Holistically speaking, with Joe Schoen, from a general manager standpoint, your opinion, are you okay? Are you for what he did this offseason, getting aggressive despite not maybe necessarily being at the beginning of a rookie quarterback contract, or on the flip side, not necessarily having what's guaranteed to be your franchise quarterback under contract?
Yeah, I mean, I think they couldn't have done much different, because they had already made the mistakes, or they'd already put themselves in this position, right? The things to criticize them about, I think, were last offseason, where
Okay.
it felt like they tried to get too greedy. They had one franchise tag and two players they wanted to keep. And I think a disciplined, smart front office would have looked at that and say, Daniel Jones is a quarterback made for the franchise tag. He's a guy that showed positive signs, that gave us some encouragement, that has first round pedigree, but there's no way we can guarantee we're going to get that again next year. We need to play him on the 1 year franchise tag, see what he can do, and then make the decision again next year. Instead, they were like, or we could give him this contract and use the franchise tag to keep Saquon Barkley in the building. And now we've got the best of both worlds. And I think that was evidently a mistake given how Daniel Jones played. And even because Daniel Jones played so badly, even keeping Saquon Barkley around wasn't necessarily a net positive move, because he's not capable of raising the bar of everything all by himself, that he needs the infrastructure. So I think they made mistakes last offseason that had this knock-on effect this offseason. But given the situation they were in, where their options were effectively one more year of Daniel Jones and see how it goes, or completely pivot, draft a quarterback, at 6 overall, this, I think, was probably the right way of doing it. Give Daniel Jones another year, try and improve the infrastructure, improve the offensive line, improve the receiving core. And then if he's not the guy, we'll be in the similar kind of position this time next year and be able to get the quarterback that time.
You ever feel sluggish or out of focus? Are you stressed? Has your digestive system caused discomfort or flatulence like a certain co-host on this podcast during a live stream? If so, you should check out AG1. When I started drinking AG1 daily, I could feel a real difference in my daily health. I had more energy, I was better off at the gym, and I could focus on my work in a much more efficient manner. That's because AG1 is a foundational nutrition supplement that supports your body's universal needs like gut optimization, stress management, and immune support. Since 2010, AG1 has led the future of foundational nutrition, continuously refining their formula to create a smarter, better way to elevate your baseline health. Not only did I replace my multivitamin with AG1, but I love that every scoop also includes prebiotics, probiotics, and digestive enzymes for gut support. I recommend AG1 to all my family and friends because AG1 has a team of doctors and scientists that formulate around the latest science and maintains high quality standards within the industry. Even my friends have started drinking AG1, and they always tell me how energetic they feel and how it's helped them out at the gym, and also it's helped them manage their stress levels. That's why we're happy to have AG1 as our partner. If you want to take ownership of your health, it starts with AG1. Try AG1 and get a free 1-year supply of vitamin D3, K2, and 5 free AG1 travel packs when you first subscribe. Go to drinkag1.com/banter. That's drinkag1.com/banter to check it out. Our mental and physical well-being is of the utmost importance. Whether you're a world-class athlete or a podcaster like me, we all need to take that very seriously. That's why I'm excited that Unified Healing is sponsoring this episode of the Big Blue Banter podcast. Unified Healing is a new and super innovative global network of wellness centers powered by Energy Enhancement System, or EE System. If you haven't heard of the EE System yet, you'll want to listen up. This technology promotes wellness, deep relaxation, purification, and rejuvenation. Whether you're here in New York, New Jersey, Arizona, if you will, or hundreds of other locations across the globe, access to a center is easy and affordable. Interested in experiencing the EE System technology for yourself? Go to unifiedhealing.com/banter to learn more and find a center near you. That's UNIFYD healing.com/banter. No material or testimonials on the Unified Healing website are intended to be viewed as medical advice or a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified healthcare providers with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition or treatment. And before undertaking a new healthcare regimen, include EE system.
I like that breakdown, Sam. And I want to get to the draft now. And I did find a tweet of yours, which got me a little excited and should excite some Giants fans as well, that you said the Giants were one of the 6 teams that you listed as having one of the best drafts, with the Colts, Lions, Dolphins, Saints, and the Eagles, from your point of view. I want to start with the beginning of this draft and start to unpack it from there, with the decision at 6 to go with Malik Neighbors overall, 6 overall, instead of maybe JJ McCarthy at 6, or potentially, we don't need to talk about the trade up because that we don't know the details and if they, how possible that even was, if the Patriots were willing to. But as far as what was on the board for them at 6, how do you feel about the decision to go with Malik Neighbors over those quarterbacks first? And secondly, give us your analysis of Neighbors as a wide receiver.
Yeah, I think it was the right call. The quarterbacks available, I didn't love any of those guys. Maybe, other teams certainly felt differently. The Atlanta Falcons evidently loved Michael Penix Jr. But I think given what was available, I would have taken the wide receiver, knowing that you can come back for a quarterback next year if that's the way it goes. Neighbors, the top 3 receivers in this class, Marvin Harrison, Malik Neighbors, and Rome Odunze, any of the 3 in most draft classes would be the number 1 receiver in that draft class. Like on all 3 of them just came along at the same time. And that's why you sort of heard various times through the draft process, any of the 3 could be the best guy, because I think they're all legitimately elite receiver prospects. Neighbors has, that special acceleration, burst, run after the catch skills. He's got great hands. He's got great body control. He's got great route running chops. My only concern with him at all was he has this tendency to use a kind of shoulder shrug release off the offensive line rather than use his hands. And I think that's something they kind of teach at LSU. It's not necessarily a Malik Neighbors flaw, but it is something I think that does need to change in the NFL. There's already plays on his tape where you can see it gets him stuck on contact that he should be clearing because he's bigger, faster, stronger than the guy that's trying to stop him. If he fixes that, or if he changes that in the NFL, I mean, he could be, the sky's the limit. I mean, he could make the kind of impact that Odell Beckham Jr. did, a decade ago when he came out of LSU. So I think he's got that kind of ability and potential. And I think that's absolutely the right call to add him to the offense at 6.
Did you have a specific, did he rank above Harrison for you, below Harrison, above Rome, or did you kind of feel like they were pretty equal?
I think they're very close together. Okay. I had Harrison as the best receiver of the 3. But Neighbors, like, it's the kind of thing where if someone else had Neighbors number 1, I wouldn't even argue against it. It's not the way I had it, but I would 100% understand somebody coming down the other way and wouldn't even construct a particularly strong argument against it. Like, they're right. That close.
And it was interesting because for the Giants, at least depth chart wise, I don't know if he necessarily fit from a depth chart standpoint. They really needed kind of more of an outside big receiver, but I feel like they looked at the film and they felt like the trait they're looking for is separation above all else. And maybe he provides it a different level than those 2, but we'll see. Another pick they made, their 2nd round pick. This is one that you, at least I saw you mention as one of the great value picks of this draft class. I think it was on NFL Network where you mentioned that, but correct me if I'm wrong. And I think you said that if he hadn't run the 40 time he ran, he would have been a 1st round pick. And we found out as Giants fans after the process that he had rushed back his recovery from an injury to kind of test for the combine and the pro day, and it impacted his testing. So what are your thoughts on Nubin? Do you still view him as one of the better value picks in this class?
Yeah, I think Tyler Nubin has 1st round tape. 1st round tape, 2nd round 40 time was effectively the analysis of him. If he was a guy that ran, a 4.4 flat, I think he would have gone in the 1st round. His tape is absolutely outstanding. I mean, he takes on blocks close to the line of scrimmage better than most linebackers in this draft. He's got a good feel for coverage. He's got, my favorite trait that he brings to the table is his ability to, when you're playing safety, you've got this difficult task where you've got to have your eyes on the quarterback, but also your eyes on the route combinations and where the receivers are coming and, the kind of interplay there. And you can't do both of those at the same time, right? You've got to, by definition, you can only look at one or the other. Your periphery is not good enough to be able to sort of monitor them both at the same time, but he's really good at being able to sort of bounce between the 2 of them and keep both pictures in his head at the same time. And like understand when to key in on which thing is coming and where it's going to go. So I think he's great in coverage. I think he's really good against the run as well. And like I said, he runs a faster 40. I think we're talking about a 1st round player.
I love that you mentioned that he's also good against the run. That's something I noticed when watching his tape, and it's something the Giants, in my opinion, specifically needed in their secondary, a more physicality. And that gets me to their next draft pick, one that's been, I think, of all the draft picks the Giants made, Sam, this is the one the fans are the least not excited about, but I would say the most controversial, because they felt at that point Christian Haynes should come off the board to the Giants, or Cooper Beebe who went to the Cowboys just a few picks later, given obviously the offensive line woes over the last 5-10 years for this franchise. But they did go Drew Phillips, the corner out of Kentucky. What are your thoughts on Phillips?
Yeah, and I certainly wouldn't have hated a pick on the offensive line at this spot. I think they're definitely a team that could easily have kept going and added players on the offensive line during the course of the draft, in addition to the moves that they made in free agency. Phillips, though, I think he's a good corner. Like, a lot of people were really high on Phillips in this draft process, and I really liked, I think, the first 5 picks that the Giants made. I think, like, in terms of the players they brought in, every time they made a draft pick, I was like, oh, look, I really like that guy. This is stacking up to be a really good draft. So I think, yeah, you could definitely make the argument that in terms of need and position value and those kinds of things, actually they should have gone offensive line here. But I think they got a really good player when they in the pick that they made.
Yeah, and I think ultimately when it comes down to it, when you do value need over the better players, you tend to see the teams that are just struggling to compete in the NFL consistently. You just can't do it. I know some teams will tell you that they're making picks based on matching need with value, but I feel like sometimes that's a little bit of a, coach hubris, or just trying to sell the fans on a pick that may not be there. But I'm definitely intrigued by the next 2 picks, and you mentioned that you like them both as well. Let's start with Theo Johnson, these 2 picks were 2 of my favorite players in the class from a value standpoint. So I want to start with Theo Johnson, who, to me, from when I watch Theo Johnson, I'm like, if this dude had anywhere near competent quarterback play at Penn State, we could be looking at completely different stats. Specifically, he had 7 touchdowns last year. It was a career high. I watched on tape, there were at least 2 to 3 that should have been touchdowns as well, that Drew Aller just simply missed them on. Or sometimes, unfortunately for Aller, I just feel like the processing is a real big issue for him. He doesn't see open receivers or feel where they're going to be. What are your thoughts on Theo Johnson? Is he more just an athlete that they have to kind of develop and hope to hit on, or can he play earlier than people expect?
No, I mean, I think he can play. I don't think he's the most nuanced receiver in the world. When you compare him to guys like, say, from a year ago, like Dalton Kincaid or players like that, I don't think he's as far along as those guys, but he's certainly not just like an athlete that's a complete project. Even within this draft class, I think there's more savvy and nuance to his route running and his ability to understand defenses than, say, Sanders, that the Carolina Panthers got drafted. I think he's further along than somebody like Sanders is. So, he's this huge body. I don't think people appreciate just how big this guy is. Like, he's 260 pounds. Like, it's a throwback
6'6".
tight end body, not just a guy that's, I mean, the difference between him and a Brock Bowers in terms of size is night and day. I mean, he's got 20 pounds and several inches in height over somebody like Brock Bowers. But yeah, he's a great athlete, and there's some nuance to his game. So I think it's great Darren Waller insurance, and a guy that, even if he needs to be their number 1 tight end, maybe you're not going to get, a dominant rookie season out of him, but I think he can definitely be a contributor and even keep his head above water if he has to be their starter at the position.
Yeah, and I think what stands out for him as far as maybe playing year one is there are some reps on tape where you see him in pass protection. You're like, okay, like against Ohio State, you're like, all right, because the Giants are certainly going to probably need that if Evan Neal is going to get the job in week 1. A little bit of help there on his side of the field, but definitely excited about Theo Johnson. I want to get to their last draft pick with you, Tyrone Tracy Jr., another player who is a my guy. One of my favorite things about what you guys do over at PFF is the advanced stats, and specifically for the running back position, I really love yards after contact per attempt and forced missed tackles. These are metrics that I think you guys have proven over time are 2 of the stickiest as far as predicting who's going to be successful at that position. And these are 2 metrics that Tyrone Tracy was really, really good in last season. I think he had the most yards after contact per attempt in this class, if I read that right. And I know he was in the top 5 at forced missed tackles. So what are your thoughts on Tyrone Tracy? Did he fall here a lot because of his age and inexperience of position? Is he more of a project than maybe I'm giving it credit for? Or is there some real upside here?
I think he is a bit of a project, but I think there's also real upside there. I think I ended up settling on him at number 6 in my running back rankings.
Oh, wow.
But he is like he's an unusual prospect, and I think this is the draft process now is becoming more like this because of COVID, because of NIL money. We're getting a lot of these players that in normal drafts, 3-4 years ago would be a bunch of red flags, right? This old guy who didn't really do it until year 4 or 5. All these things are negatives. Like, these are not usually what you want to see, but now you're seeing a ton of these guys because they're all going back to college. They're all playing that extra year. They took advantage of the COVID season. So it's you have to change the grading curve, right? You can't just look at these guys and say these are all things we don't like in a prospect because of previous years. The landscape has changed, and now you need to look at these guys and say, okay, yeah, it's an unusual pathway. We don't usually like guys that are this old that took this long to be good. On the other hand, there's a ton of them now, and this is what we're left with. So Tyron Tracy's a guy that used to be a wide receiver. They moved him to running back. It's late into his career, but he's really good at running back, and he's really good despite not really having a great idea what he's doing. Like, he's so new and raw at it. Like, he's the embodiment of what a raw running back looks like. And maybe, now you have to project, right? Maybe he'll never get that. Maybe that's just who he is. He's too far behind the curve. You'll never get him up to speed mentally with sort of how to play the position and all those kinds of things. On the other hand, if you say, okay, it was basically his first time doing it, now we can teach him and we'll be further along. The stuff that you can't teach is insane. And it's the stuff you talked about. Like, he's so hard to get to the ground. It doesn't always look pretty, but he's always finding a way of just bumbling forward and, careening through contact and bouncing off a guy and spinning through the next guy. And it looks chaotic and crazy, but it's always going forwards. He's always gaining additional yardage while he does it. And it's so hard to get to the ground. So, like, where they drafted him, I say incredible value. Grab a guy like that, gamble on the fact that you can bridge the gap between where he is mentally now and where you need him to be. And if you can do that, he's an absolute steal at that point. And if you can't, I mean, that's when you take gambles like that anyway. It's like there's a reason they're being drafted that low, as opposed to, like, if it wasn't a projection, if we already knew he could do that, he'd be a first-round player.
Right. I completely agree with you. And I'd love to take those gambles on skill position players at that stage of the draft, because I just feel like the hit rate and, people are like, why didn't they take an offensive lineman there? It's like, you're taking an offensive lineman there and he's most likely not going to develop. You're not going to, Trey Smith is not just sitting around in every 5th round of every draft for, medical off-field concerns. And I love how you described it, Sam, because I feel like anyone who watched just one game of Tracy, you can go back and if you're listening now and do it. It's exactly that. It's not pretty. It doesn't look right technically, but it's great and it works. And like you said, he's so hard to bring down on first contact. He's really got way more power than people realize. And in addition to all those elite traits, what's interesting to me is, like, he just basically exclusively ran out of shotgun. So we'll see how that translates to the NFL. And then the pass protection is like the real thing. Like, is he going to get on the field? If he's going to have to prove himself there. It was better, I think, toward the end of his season, and that's probably a good sign as he's learning the position. But just want to temper expectations for Giants fans as far as, like, yes, we're dealing with a really good athlete who can add explosiveness to an offense that doesn't have it. But at the same time, it might take some time. I want to ask you overall, when you said the Giants had one of the best drafts, is it just based on what you kind of broke down, the value of it, or is there something else to that?
Yeah, I mean, just, I think they got good value at the picks. I like the players that they selected. I just think that they, given where they were and the number of times they drafted, and if I was going to quibble, that would be the one sort of criticism is, this is a team that needs a lot of help. I would have tried to trade back a bit, tried to add some more swings of the bat. But if those were the picks that they had, and those are the players they end up with, I don't know that you can do much better.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with you on this. I know it's a little bit controversial. Some Giants fans are quarterback or bust in this class, and I understand that to an extent because of what they've dealt with at quarterback. But at the same time, I feel like when you're just jamming quarterback and pressing jam button, it's how you end up with Daniel Jones in 2019, personally. Because I know you said he had first-round pedigree, but I feel like there weren't too many evaluators who had a first-round grade on him outside of Dave Gettleman there. But maybe you never know. That going back too far. Speaking of that, let's end it on a couple questions about kind of where this team is moving forward. You said they had a great draft, according to you, one of the 6 best. We talked about their offseason before that. Where do you stand on the big debate, which is Daniel Jones versus Drew Lock as their quarterback for 2024?
I mean, I don't see how Drew Lock can win that job unless Daniel Jones is a complete disaster in training camp. Like, Drew Lock, he's effectively just a lower cost version of Daniel Jones. They have the same, they both got good arms. Daniel Jones is more mobile than Drew Lock, though Lock's got some mobility to his game. They're both, I think, similarly capable, but Daniel Jones has got a little bit more pedigree, a little bit more proven quality to his game. I don't really buy the idea that it's a competition necessarily as much as one and it's only a competition if Daniel Jones is horrendous, right? Like that's the kind of competition it is. Drew Lock is who you bring in and say, this is an active competition if you expect the other guy to win the job. He's not the guy that you bring in as like real viable competition for somebody that you think has a real jeopardy of losing the job, because nobody wants to go into the season with Drew Lock as their starting quarterback. That's just the reality of the situation.
That's fair. I think I would ask you this is like, if put on your GM hat for a quick second on this note, does the injury guarantee for Daniel Jones 2025 factor into your decision if you were making it at all? Because if he does get injured, and he's had 2 season-ending injuries, if he has a third and he can't pass the March physical next year, they're on the hook for another $23 million in guaranteed money against the 2025 cap.
It wouldn't change my opinion to start the year, but maybe again, like that becomes the Russell Wilson situation or Derek Carr before that, where at some point during the season, that might be a conversation you want to have given how things are going. But I don't think it should be part of your decision-making process in May this year. You know, when you're trying to project what your team is going to be going into the year, it's maybe something you pivot to if things aren't going well.
Yeah, and I know, contrary to maybe some belief who listen to this podcast who referred to me as a Daniel Jones hater, which I don't consider myself one of, just evaluate what I see. I think Sam's spot on. From a ceiling standpoint, Daniel Jones is by far and away their highest ceiling option here. And he's less late on throws than Drew Lock is, which people don't realize, but it's going to impact the offense. And he has more mobility and has proven more as a quarterback. Now, I think Sam's right. If they start to lose games, that's when the decision becomes a little bit more tricky there. Now, let's end on this, Sam. I'm curious to get your take on just where this franchise is at moving forward. Do you think there's a chance they can do what they did in 2022 and just, everyone's expecting them to win 4 to 6 games and they make the playoffs? Or is this going to be kind of a transition year for the Giants where they're looking ahead toward a big quarterback decision heading into 2025?
Yeah, I mean, I think they have a fairly broad range of outcomes. This could be almost the season that was supposed to be last year, where they've repaired things around Daniel Jones a bit, and suddenly you're able to see the high-end version of Daniel Jones, where he's still a big rushing threat. Malik Neighbors is a true number 1 guy right out of the gate, and Jones is able to make the rest of it work because they're good enough. It might be that season. Or, if Daniel Jones is still just going to be a letdown at quarterback and part of the problem as opposed to part of the solution, then they're going to have another struggle and they're going to need to make a change at that position before anything positive happens.
Yeah, I think that's really what it comes down to. And I like what you said earlier. Really think of Daniel Jones as a quarterback who maybe if they can get this O-line right, he can take that step forward that they were hoping that he would when they signed him. Sam, thank you so much for taking the time today to talk Giants football with us. You can find Sam on the PFF NFL podcast. They do a great job throughout the season there, and he's grinding tape. I know you said you really only have 1 or 2 weeks off here, so get back to work, Sam. Not just kidding.
Anytime.